What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Friday, November 3rd edition of the NBA Lineup Generator video. I am your host, Adam Scherer. You can follow me on Twitter at ShipMyMoneyDFS. We have a 7-game NBA slate tonight to take a look at using the Lineup Generator. If you're not familiar with this tool, it is a quick way to get quality lineups. It simulates a bunch of lineups on the back end, figures out which ones are profitable, which ones you expect to make money over time, and then presents those lineups to you. And you can choose from them, select up to 20, enter them into your DraftKings or FanDuel contests. This is a great tool if you play single entry, only play a few lineups, you're not a 150 maxer, or you play lower stakes where it doesn't necessarily make sense for you to spend the money for the full Sims package. You're still getting quality lineups that are based on our simulation tool. So very, very good tool for a lot of people. And you can get it right now using promo code NBA Treat. Get it $4.99 for your first week. Try it out. Hopefully make some money with it right out of the gate. Now we're going to take a look at how to use it and what's showing up right now early on, starting with DraftKings. Now, the first option you get here is the type of ownership that you want in your lineups. You can choose contrarian lineups, balanced lineups, chalky lineups, depending on what sort of contest you're playing. You can also just choose all lineups and you're going to get a nice mix. That's what I prefer to do. And then here you can lock players if you want to. That's not part of my approach. It's not something I recommend, so I'm going to skip over that. And then now I'm just going to select the first 20 lineups that we get, and we can take a look at those lineups, what players we're getting to. You can also see here as you're looking at these lineups, not only does it have each player in the lineup, your total fantasy point projection, your total salary, and your total ownership, and then also individually for each player. Down at the bottom, it also tells you where it ranks in terms of projection and whether it is more contrarian or more chalky. So here we have a lineup that projects pretty well and it's relatively contrarian. Those are lineups that you're typically going to really like. So we're going to select 20 of these and then take a look at some of those lineups. Here, starting on the right-hand side, you have the player exposures. Now, keep in mind, this is early in the day, so take these kind of with a grain of salt. You're going to get more value, more news throughout the day, and it's going to change some things. Ownership projections are going to change. Player projections may change in some cases. So keep that in mind, but we can take a look at what we're getting right now just to get more familiar with the tool. And we can see right here that Malcolm Brogdon's coming in at the top. We're getting 70% of him at 6,500. That makes a lot of sense. He's one of the more popular guys on the slate. The Blazers are without Scoot Henderson, so you have a lot more minutes available. You have more offensive production available. Brogdon makes a lot of sense. Derrick Jones Jr. at 3,600. Nothing exciting about him. We just don't have a lot of cheap value today. He's probably more of a placeholder right now. Like, I'd be very surprised if we're actually getting this much Derrick Jones when we get the lock. And if you are, if say you do use this tool on your own and you are getting to somebody like Derrick Jones where you're like, okay, I understand that he's a viable play, but I don't need 65% of him. What you can do is you click him here on the right-hand side. All of the Derrick Jones Jr. lineups are now highlighted in yellow. You can scroll through those, delete some of them, lower that exposure that way, and then go down here to where it says get more lineups and replace those lineups with non-Derrick Jones Jr. lineups. So that's something to keep in mind if you do get a situation where you're like, look, I just don't want this much of him. Same thing here with like Kevin Love at 40%. He's a good play. He's cheap. He's 4,300, but 40% is also a lot. So you can do that. Jamal Murray showing up 35% of the time. No problems with that at 7,900. Shadon Sharp. Again, the Blazers are going to be a very popular team today for good reason. Josh Richardson at 4K, played about 30 minutes the other day for Miami. He's in a very good matchup against Washington. And again, we just don't have a lot of cheap value. Jalen Williams without Shai Gilgeous-Alexander is going to look very good. He's showing up around 30% of the time. So you can see here, all the players we're getting to, how much we're getting to. And I also like to compare it to the overall ownership projections just to see if anybody at the top of ownership is getting noticeably left out of our player exposures. And looking down the ownership list, Malcolm Brogdon, Jalen Williams, we have both of those guys. Nikola Vucevic, we have him. Derrick Jones Jr. is getting 29% ownership. There is no Maxi Kleber today, so that's good for his playing time. We're obviously over the field there. Jeremy Grant is pulling 28% ownership. We are not getting to as much of him, it doesn't look like. He's right up here. We have 15%, so around half the field on Jeremy Grant. Isaiah Joe pulling 26%. He's not showing up for us in any abundance right now. The assumption is that he's going to start in place of Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, but it really could be a number of guys. Marcus Smart showing up 25% of the time. We're getting there. Luke Kennard showing up as another value play at 3,600, 22% of the time with no Derrick Rose. We have 20% of him. So Jeremy Grant looks like Jeremy Grant and Isaiah Joe, the two guys very high up in ownership that we're just not getting to right now. And now we can look at the individual lineups, starting with this first one. 263.5 fantasy points, 133% projected ownership. So we see that it's relatively low owned, and the fantasy point projections kind of middle of the pack when you look at some of the other lineups. Looking at the lineup individually, Jamal Murray, 22% owned, Tyler Hero at 9%, RJ Barrett at 4%, Jalen Smith at 4%. So we have a couple contrarian plays mixed in there, which you really like to see. And then Nikola Vucevic, Josh Richardson, Derek Jones Jr., Bam Adebayo, those guys all getting some ownership, but not really problematic once you have your Tyler Hero, RJ Barrett, Jalen Smith pieces. Now, moving on to the next lineup, projects about the same, a little bit more popular. We can go down to this third one, 272 fantasy point projection, 200% aggregate ownership. So it is a little bit more popular, but it does also project about 9 points better than that first lineup we looked at. Jamal Murray again at 22%, Desmond Bane at 12%, Shadon Sharp, very popular play at small forward, 22% owned, Derek Jones Jr., cheap value play, that's popular. Kevin Love, 4,300, 9.5% owned, so offsetting some ownership there. Malcolm Brogdon at 66%, that's just always going to drive up that aggregate ownership. David Roddy as a value, we have people going to Luke Kennard. We're taking David Roddy. Hopefully he beats Kennard out for the sake of this lineup at least. And then Vucevic rounding out the lineup. So you can see even in a chalkier lineup, you still do have a couple of contrarian plays. Now we are going to go and do the same thing for FanDuel. And again, if you want to use this tool for yourself, whether that's DraftKings, FanDuel, both, use the promo code NBA Treat. It's above my head on this video. There's a link in the description below on YouTube. I'll also tweet out a link if you're watching it on Twitter. Now, looking at the top FanDuel lineups, again, we're just going to select the first 20 for the sake of this video and take a look at those. Same thing that we did on DraftKings. Malcolm Brogdon coming in at the top. Again, not surprising. He is $6,500, 70% owned. We have 70%. He's projected for 63% ownership, highest on the slate. Xavier Tillman coming in about 50% of our lineups. He's projected for 32% ownership, only 5,400. We're getting a lot of Obi Toppin, which is scary, and that's the kind of guy where maybe you do lower that a little bit if you're using this on your own closer to lock. He's only projected for 7% ownership, so if you wanted to, you could certainly walk that back a bit and still be over the field. Max Strus is kind of up in the air right now as well. Darius Garland and Jared Allen both questionable for Cleveland. Garland in particular makes a big difference for Strus and how we're going to like him, but 5,400 on FanDuel is a much more reasonable price tag than 6,200 on DraftKings. Now looking at the individual lineups, this first one relatively popular, 204% aggregate ownership, 307 fantasy points, 4% own Kyrie Irving, so we're contrarian right out of the gate. Jamal Murray, very popular at 7,400, as he should be. Brogdon, very popular, as he should be. Jalen Williams playing without SGA, also 40+% owned. Desmond Bane at only 8,100, small forward, 36% owned. So a lot of chalk in those four spots. But then we get to Derek Jones Jr., who on FanDuel is only 2% owned, 4,600. So he's $1,000 more than on DraftKings. Much riskier play than he is on DraftKings, but as a result, only 2% owned. Obi Toppin, as I mentioned, not very popular. We're getting a lot of him. Kevin Love, Bam Adebayo to round out that lineup. If we want to find one that's a little bit more contrarian, 170% aggregate ownership on the second lineup here, still about a 307 fantasy point projection. 18% owned Jalen Brunson, 22% owned Smart, 10% to Jordan Poole at 6,700. Joke of an NBA player, but he is cheap and will get opportunities with Washington. Jalen Williams, one of the best plays on the slate. Bruce Brown, only 5,300, 13% owned. We do have a Q tag on Tyrese Halliburton as well, so the potential for a little bit more production for Brown if he were to be ruled out. Derek Jones Jr., again, as a contrarian play. And you can see over on the right-hand side, we're getting around 10x the field on Derek Jones Jr. Not a play that I love, but, again, we need value somewhere. Jeremy Grant, 48% owned. We're a little below the field here. We were way below the field on DraftKings, but he's only $6,100 and looks pretty good. Getting to Obi Toppin again, and then paying up for Nikola Jokic. And while he is a stud and one of the best players in the NBA, or the best player in the NBA, one of the best fantasy players in the NBA, he's only getting 9% ownership today because of the lack of value, because of the opportunity cost at center. So that does make him a solid contrarian option. That's all I have for you today. Thanks for checking out the video. Good luck on your lineups and enjoy your weekend.